For everyone attending, thank you. Hello, my name's Laura Dodd. I'm the Senior Transportation Planner for the City of Port St. Lucie and Project Manager for Phase 2 of the Mobility Plan. Phase 2 of the Mobility Plan includes a list of short and long-term projects ranging from stop signs and crosswalk improvements to major mobility and capacity projects, which represent the critical upgrades the community that will need and how to improve everyone getting around. Jonathan Paul and Lauren Rushing of New Urban Concepts will lead the meeting and welcome the input that the public and mobility stakeholders will contribute. You may provide comments during the presentation in the Q&A box, but please note that Jonathan will likely address them after the presentation. So on behalf of the City of Port St. Lucie, we thank you for your time to attend this meeting or watch our past meeting recordings. As we finalize Phase 2 of the Mobility Plan, I encourage you to stay up to date on our progress by visiting the Mobility Plan landing page located on the city's website. That being said, thank you again for your attendance, and we will begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Thank you all very much for attending today, and we're here to present the second workshop over the Phase 2 Mobility Plan for the City of Port St. Lucie. Back last year, this is a process that's now been going on for about a year and a half. The City of Port St. Lucie embarked on a Phase 1 mobility plan and the development of a mobility fee. The mobility plan laid out a vision for the next 23 years for how people are going to move about the city and even into the greater portions of St. Lucie County and upwards to Fort Pierce. The mobility fee is a simple, transparent way for new development to mitigate its impact to the transportation system. And so as part of the initial phase, we developed that fee, and that fee has now been in effect for roughly 6 months, 7 months now. Actually, I guess parts of it went into effect actually October of last year, so for 9 months. And now we're getting into the more detailed portion of the mobility plan Phase 2. So similar to the Phase 1, the mobility plan is really a transition away from moving cars, which is what the primary bases for the transportation concurrency, proportionate share, and roadway impact fees systems. Those are really primarily focused on how do we move cars quickly from point A to point B, and then how does a developer mitigate for its traffic impact. A mobility plan actually looks at all modes of travel, whether somebody elects to walk, bicycle, ride transit, use a new form of technology, such as an electric scooter, take shared mobility, such as an Uber or Lyft. And we also are still recognizing that people are going to drive, but it's just not going to be the only mode of travel for which we plan for. And so the Phase 1 mobility plan really focused on identifying corridors where the city likely needed to consider new road capacity, plus making multimodal improvements. And then there are certain corridors where there are not going to be road widenings or adding turn lanes, and there would be complete streets, sidewalks, bicycle lanes, adding a dedicated transit lane possibly, or even transit stops. We also looked at intersections and whether those intersections needed to have new capacity, either through a signal, a roundabout, or adding turn lanes, or if there needed to be multimodal improvements such as narrowing crossing distances or making pavement markings more visible to motorists. So the Phase 1 mobility plan really took a high-level approach and evaluated whether there was a need to add capacity for roads or a need to make multimodal improvements. And that sort of formed the basis for the mobility fee, with the intention that further detail would come on as part of the Phase 2 mobility plan which is where we are today. And that is actually a detailed description and identification of improvements, both multimodal and for roadways, identifying both interim capacity projects, stuff that could be done in the next few years, and then longer term potential widening of roadways. And we also focus quite a bit on creative mobility solutions to get people around by means other than driving. And really that's where we are in terms of phase 2 of the mobility plan. So previously, prior to the city adopting a phase 1 mobility plan, the priority and the emphasis was really on vehicles and moving cars and moving them quickly as possible, evaluating longer trip lengths, addressing and dealing with roadway crashes, and really designing a system for commuting for vehicles. The streets of the future, which really the city had already done a comprehensive plan amendment that laid the groundwork for a mobility plan and for a multimodal system. And the phase 1 sort of took it to the next level. And the phase 2 is getting really into the overall detail of projects with a priority on lowering vehicle speeds on local and collector roads. There's a direct connection between speed of travel and the safety for people walking, bicycling, and accessing transit. So we want to emphasize slower speeds on local and collector roadways and safety for all users on arterial roadways. We also want to focus on accessibility, how easy it is for people to get to and from wherever their destinations are. Ultimately, enacting, or moving towards Vision Zero with the ultimate goal of 0 deaths on the roadways or zero serious injuries. Will we ever achieve that? That's really something that's going to be decided in the future. But the goal is to move towards that type of a system and really designing a street network for all users of the transportation system. And so beyond just walking or bicycling or driving a car, there are new forms of travel that are being considered all across Florida, whether they be an electric bike, riding a neighborhood electric vehicle or a golf cart, electric scooters, water taxis, and even ride hailing or ride share services. Most people are familiar with Uber and Lyft. But those are becoming an increasing way for more and more people to get around other than just driving. And there's also an opportunity to look at our streets differently. So typically, I call it in some respects, complete streets 1.0. That's where we've been for the last 20 years as a transportation planning and engineering in the state of Florida. So the focus has been on just getting a base level of facilities, whether they be a 4-foot side or a 4-foot bike lane or a 5-foot sidewalk, but getting just a bare minimum multimodal to our street cross sections. Well, as more and more communities across Florida are urbanizing and they've reached the point where they've already 4-laned roadways or 6-laned roadways, there really aren't a whole lot of road capacity alternatives open anymore. If they are, they're fewer as part of the overall network. What there are opportunities is to go to essentially complete streets 2.0. And that's really focusing more on providing safe, highly visible, connected multimodal facilities, whether they be a shared use path, an off-street trail, a dedicated lane for scooters or transit vehicles, or enhanced landscaping and lighting. And longer term, and this is something we will get into as part of the overall plan for a longer vision, is how do you go from your existing roadway, make your first round of incremental improvements, then as you move forward, provide more and more multimodal facilities. And the graphic you see down on the left-hand side is just an example of that. That's a military trail in the city of Palm Beach Gardens. Suburban urbanizing community, very similar to Port St. Lucie. And this is a 6-lane arterial with a 4-foot bike lane and a 5-foot sidewalk. The mobility plans call for eventually widening that on-street bike lane to a multimodal lane for scooters and bikes, and then eventually making it even wider for autonomous transit shuttles, similar to you see what's operating out in Traditions. In addition to adding multimodal trails or wider paths and much more extensive landscaping. So the environment goes from the photo you see to the left, just bare bones grass, concrete sidewalk, to something that's highly amenitized that people would actually want to walk and bicycle on. Further, there's going to be opportunities, especially in the western portion of the community, and even on some roadways potentially on the eastern side, but to reimagine what's already built or to build differently as we build a new roadway. And this is an example of Gateway Drive in Altamont Springs. Lauren and I worked on this mobility plan and mobility fee. It's currently a 4-lane divided roadway with an on-street bike lane and a 5-foot sidewalk. And it's serving an office park with multifamily housing units coming online, an additional hospital and some other healthcare facilities. But again, it's a community that's suburban in nature, that's urbanizing, very similar to what you see in Port St. Lucie. And so the mobility plan called for, and they're actually, the city is underway designing it, taking one of those lanes and adding a dedicated lane for the autonomous transit shuttles, or a trolley circulator, or like even a neighborhood electric vehicle. Think of it as like a souped up golf cart, to use part of that lane. And then the other part for electric scooters, electric bicycles, and even golf carts. And really it's just restriping the roadway and using some paint. Now this graphic is for illustration purposes. Ultimately, the whole lane may not be colored, but it may be, in terms of the maroon color, which is somewhat standard for dedicated transit facilities. But this is using the infrastructure that's already in place and basically tripling or quadrupling the number of modes that can actually use the corridor. And so the previous system of transportation really focused on cars, but it left out a pretty large segment of the population, especially in Port St. Lucie, and that's school-age kids. I have school-age children myself. They walk, they bicycle, they look for having multimodal facilities to get to and from home to where they're ultimately going to school. And that's anywhere from 5 or 6 year olds up to 18-year-olds going to high school. That's one of the fastest growing demographics in the city of Port St. Lucie. The city also has a wealth of neighborhood and community parks in addition to schools, but there are also a lot of roadways, and I believe this photo is actually Port St. Lucie Boulevard south of Gatlin, where you don't have any sidewalks at all. Forget even a complete street bike lane sidewalk. There's not even a sidewalk. And so really there's a strong focus on making sure we have a core set of multimodal facilities and then building on that into the future. So the streets of the future, there's been a lot of studies that have been undertaken, similar to a lot of free goods. If you've taken any economics classes in college, if you have a free good, people will use it as much as they can because there's really no barrier or cost to entry. Similarly, when you build or add new road capacity, people start driving on it because it takes them quicker from where they were going to where they want to go. And in essence, what's known as induced demand, or build it and they'll come. As soon as you add capacity, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, much of that capacity is already consumed because people have changed their driving patterns. So to continue thinking that you can just build your way out of congestion or just build enough roads to meet future demand, nobody's been able to do it. Not in the US, not in Florida, not globally. China has facilities that are 20 and 30 lanes wide, and every single one of them is packed. The Houston area has the Katy Freeway, which I think is probably one of the biggest cross sections in the US, and it's 26 lanes of travel, and their congestion is worse than it's ever been on those roads. So there really is somewhat of a fallacy that you can continue just to build roads to meet future travel demands. There's also, why are we doing sidewalks? Why are we doing bike lanes? Nobody walks, nobody bicycles. Well, the reason nobody walks and nobody bicycles is it's not safe to do so. In fact, these past few years, the number of people dying by simply walking or riding their bikes is going through the roof in the state of Florida. Doesn't matter whether you're in Tampa, where I'm at now, whether you're in Port St. Lucie, whether you're up in the Panhandle, Jacksonville, Miami. Florida as a state is the most dangerous, hands down, place for people walking and biking. And a lot of that is because there are missing sidewalks and bike lanes. But another component of it is the roads are wide and the speeds are fast. And when you combine fast speeds and wide roads, fatalities happen. So moving forward, a lot of the cross sections we're proposing are looking at 10-foot travel lanes for local streets, and arterials and collectors also having 10-foot lanes, but then providing some buffer for through shoulders, but the visible travel lane itself narrowing down to 10 feet in width, in addition to the multimodal improvements that we're talking about making. Streets of the future, especially within Port St. Lucie itself, most of the roadways in the community are known as open drainage or swale roadways. They're actually designed to hold stormwater when it rains on the side of the road. And some of the old portions of Port St. Lucie itself, a lot of residents or people that haven't been in Florida a long time, some of those neighborhoods that are built in the 70s and 80s, even early 90s, during that time, there was a trend for the roadways themselves to actually accommodate a foot of water. So the roadways themselves in communities were actually part of the stormwater system. So somebody coming from up north or coming up from an area that has a lot of curb and gutter roadways, they think there's always flooding in the city. But in fact, that's how most of the roadways were actually designed. And even parking lots and commercial shopping centers during the 70s and 80s and 90s, some parking lots are actually designed to hold a foot of water in them. But going forward, as we add multimodal facilities, there is going to be a need to add additional vegetation to treat that stormwater as it goes into the aquifer and as it eventually flows down into the St. Lucie River. And so this phase or the mobility plan phase 2, we're going to show several cross sections. We'll show several maps, but ultimately there will be maps, cross sections, and then a very detailed table that goes in to explain what's being proposed for each roadway corridor in the city. That's a collector and arterial roadway. And then also some of these corridors may have multiple phases to them, where there's a multimodal improvement initially, and then eventually there may be a widening or additional multimodal improvements. And we'll actually be producing several graphics similar to the one you see. Just for anybody that's may know the corridor, this is actually US 98 up in Sandestin between Seaside and Destin, Florida, and Walton County. And this is a 6-lane arterial, a center turn lane, very narrow bike lanes, 5-foot sidewalks. And this is an example of how you go from a very suburban car-oriented street to an actually multimodal urban street. Eventually even possibly repurposing an outside lane to actually add multimodal facilities. So these are some of the corridors we're going to look at. And as we proceed further and as part of this overall mobility plan, there'll be several graphics like this produced with St. Lucie examples. So the focus is really on corridors for the phase 1 mobility plan, and then we built on that for the phase two. And this phase two is really focusing on the speed of travel. People walking go between 1 and 7 miles an hour. People bicycling go anywhere between 7 and 15 miles an hour. People on a scooter or an electric bike could go upwards to 15 or 20 miles. People on golf carts and autonomous transit shuttles can go up to 20, and shared mobility. So really, all these speeds of travel are less than what most cars and what most posted speed limits are on roadways. I believe the lowest posted speed limit on a street in the city of Port St. Lucie is 25 miles. That's the lowest. So all these modes of travel we're talking about actually travel slower than what the lowest posted speed is within the city itself. And so this mobility ordinance is going to also be setting the stage for what's known as micromobility. These are electric bikes, electric scooters, segways. Some people may have seen them, people riding along with a skateboard with one wheel in the middle of it. It's called a one wheel. There are a whole bunch of micromobility devices out there. Electric bikes and electric scooters are the most common ones. But the plans that we're talking about really look to add facilities for those modes of travel. And we're also looking at microtransit. There's a couple of different types of microtransit. One is what a lot of people know of as golf carts, and where they're allowed versus where they're not allowed. And most people may not know this because they see their neighbors, they see other people riding around in golf carts in Port St. Lucie. Golf carts are not actually allowed on the local roads, major roads, or sidewalks anywhere in the city of Port St. Lucie. That they're not permitted on any roadway. So people are using them, basically where they're not supposed to. We will be considering as part of a second phase or a follow-up phase to the mobility plan where golf carts should be allowed. In addition, there's two other classes. One's known as a neighborhood electric vehicle. These, what most people think of, are sort of souped up golf carts. And these are actually designed to be street legal up to 35 miles an hour. If you've gone down to West Palm Beach or Delray, those are just two areas. They actually have a third-party service that's running around these neighborhood electric vehicles, and they pick people up anywhere in the downtown areas and then take them to and from places. So it's actually a pretty viable mode of travel, and similar to a golf cart, it's only 4.5 feet wide. So they can actually fit on 5-foot sidewalks and bike lanes. The third type of microtransit is for any of you that have gone out and used the autonomous transit shuttle that's running in tradition today. That vehicle itself is 8 feet wide. And so one of the issues we're running into, Tradition Parkway is one example, Village Parkway is another. Those corridors are designed with 8-foot shared use paths. Well, the microtransit, autonomous transit shuttle will actually use the entire 8 foot. So what portions of the community and some of the developers are out there doing today is they're actually adding separate facilities for those autonomous transit shuttles and for golf carts potentially. And they're 12 feet wide. Some of them may even be upwards to 14 feet wide. So they're already providing different types of facilities for those vehicles. And the mobility plan itself is looking to say, how do we expand that elsewhere into the city? And so these are just some of the examples of on-street facilities. Most people think of an on-street facility as an on-street bicycle lane. The most typical is a 4-foot, 5-foot bike lane or a paved shoulder along a roadway. Increasingly, I don't believe there are actually any in Port St. Lucie yet. There will be on Floresta, but several communities, Department of Transportation is moving towards what's known as a buffered bike lane. So you have, again, a 4 to 5 foot wide space for a bicycle, and then you have a 2 to 3 foot wide space that either has double lines on it or it has double lines and what's known as a chevron marking or a skip marking along it. Then you have protected bicycle lanes, where there's actually a raised median or some type of physical barrier between the roadway travel lanes and the bicycle lane itself. What we're calling multimodal lanes, think of a 5-foot sidewalk, but it can also be used by a golf cart or an electric bicycle or an electric scooter. That would be a multimodal lane. To allow for an autonomous transit shuttle, like what's running out on Traditions, you really need 8 feet upwards to 10 feet of a lane to accommodate those vehicles on the street themselves. So that would be what's known as a 8-foot to 10-foot wide multimodal lane. And so you see in just those two graphics, both the neighborhood electric vehicle and the autonomous shuttle are added to the larger graphic. We also looked at one corridor, and we'll share an example of that, for a dedicated transit lane along St. Lucie Boulevard. We'll get into a little bit more of that, but the community itself is not quite there yet in terms of density or intensity to actually warrant a whole dedicated lane for a bus. But there are a lot of communities that are looking to that. If you actually happen to go to downtown St. Petersburg anytime in the near future, they have just finished a 4-mile dedicated transit lane or bus rapid transit facility all the way from downtown St. Petersburg out to Treasure Island onto the beaches. So that's actually the best example in the state of Florida. I believe downtown Miami has a few examples as well, but Port St. Lucie is not quite there, but it is something that may be looked at in the future. And then there are other type of facilities that are basically a shared street. That's where these electronic modes of transportation share the street with motor vehicles. So those are all types of on-street facilities that we've looked at. We're really focused heavily on providing off-street facilities. One, they've tended to be safer. Two, they get a lot more visibility, people walking and biking. And three, most people feel safer actually using them. So they have a much higher utilization rate. So a lot of the improvements we're going to be talking about are actually off-street facilities. And if you look, I believe at Village Parkway or portions of Traditions Parkway, they're adding off-street facilities for various multimodal and micromobility vehicles. But the first one's actually like an off-street bike way. So it's a separated bike lane or a bike path, but it's for bicycles, scooters, separated from traffic. Then you have a bi-directional bikeway or cycle track separated from the street. And then eventually you get up to sidewalks. Most people know what a sidewalk is, for 5 to 7 feet. They're really not appropriate for golf carts to be using. And quite honestly, they're not appropriate for electric bikes or electric scooters to be using either, especially with people walking. Then you have a shared use path, which allows people walking, bicycling, or using a scooter. And what we like to call this is people powered. Think of if you're using your own 2 feet to move, whether you're scooting, bicycling, or walking, that's a people powered facility or a shared use path. And this can get wider. They can either be concrete or asphalt. And then off the roadway itself completely, greenways, or more commonly trails, are upwards to 12 foot to 16 foot in width. And again, those primarily accommodate right now people powered transportation, but they could include motorized. And so the term we use for motorized for planning purposes, similar to the multimodal lane on street, that signifies where you can start to use electric vehicles. The multimodal way is where you could use a golf cart, a scooter, or a bike. And those tend to be anywhere from 6 feet to 7 feet wide. And then a wider multimodal way, getting upwards to 8 foot to 10 foot, would be using your autonomous transit shuttle plus a golf cart, electric bikes, and scooters. So these are the types of facilities we're really focused on as part of the phase 2 mobility plan. So this is kind of just providing a real bigger overview, and then we're actually going to get into some of the more specific types of improvements here. But just in general, Port St. Lucie is a very large city. It's got an extensive roadway network, and not all the roadways are the same. So we've sort of developed some criteria for how we're going to look at roadways. And so the ideal multimodal scenario is you have a separate space for cars, a separate lane or way for electric powered vehicles, scooters, bike, golf cart, and then a shared use pathway or a trail for people walking, bicycling, or scooting using their own feet. As an alternative, the multi-use trails or shared use paths that are at least 12 foot to 16 foot in width could be used for people powered micromobility and golf carts. So really you're looking at the width at that point, and the minimum preferably is 12 foot wide to safely accommodate all these different users. And the third alternative that we've sort of looked at is where we can't have separate facilities because of right of way. We'd look to have an on-street multimodal lane for electric powered. And this is primarily roadways that are posted speed limits of 40 miles or less. So you're not going to necessarily see this out on Gatlin or Port St. Lucie, Boulevard, or some of those type of roadways on street. We're going to focus on off street for those. But most of the other roadways in the city could have an on street facility and then an off street for people walking or people bicycling. And then again, there are several other alternatives. I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time on them. These are basically our fallbacks. If we can't do a wider facility or we can't do separate facilities, we'll look at either an 8-foot shared use path, on-street travel lanes where they're shared with vehicles for roadways with a speed limit of 30 miles or less, and then a separate sidewalk or path. And then there will be some corridors where there's just not room. And so there'll only be a sidewalk on that roadway, collector or arterial, and golf carts will be prohibited on those roadways. And possibly there may be a prohibition against electric scooters and electric bikes as well. So there are a couple of corridors that are going to fall under that scenario. So mobility solutions that we looked at, first is multimodal only, where we're going to add those type of facilities I just shared with you. The second is focusing on adding road capacity in addition to those multimodal improvements. And so we're focused first on the multimodal network. And as we're moving forward, we're kind of identifying tiers or priority corridors. So the corridors that you see in green are really priority multimodal corridors that provide a continuous facility going north and south through the city or going east and west. And these are some roadways that already have a shared use path on them or multimodal facilities, or they tend to be the higher priority corridors. Secondly, we're looking at major multimodal corridors. And then the next phase will be minor multimodal corridors and then sort of sidewalks or local. So any of you that are familiar with street terminology, you have principal arterial roads, which are your interstate systems, or your major, your crosstown, or your Port St. Lucie or US 1. Then you have major arterials, which would be your St. Lucie or your Village Parkway, Becker Road. Then you'd have minor collectors, local roadways. So we're actually developing a similar type of terminology and typology for multimodal facilities as well as we move forward and develop the plan. And so this sort of shows what the network could look like in the future for all roadways. This facility shows where there's already pathways that exist. So the line in purple, those are already at a minimum an 8-foot shared use pathway today, maybe even wider. So there's already, we're not talking about starting from scratch. There's already a very good multimodal network in place. And we're really building on that network and making sure the gaps are going to be filled between it. And then ultimately, for the folks that really want to get into the details, we've broken down each of those facilities into an actual type, whether it be a shared use path, a sidewalk, a trail, a river walk, or a facility that exists today. And so, in its realistic template, that's what the network would look like based on facility type. But just from an overall perspective to see how everything fits together, we'll lay out this type of principal, major, minor collector corridors. So really it would help in both the prioritization of projects and also the emphasis of what are the corridors that provide the most access to schools, to parks, the places of worship, to employment centers, and also to major residential developments. So as part of the phase 1 mobility plan, we looked at what roads are we adding capacity to, either from a new road or widening a roadway, and then what roads we're only focused on for multimodal improvements. And at the time, we also considered county roads in our analyses, but since that time, we've come to a mediated settlement with the county, where they're essentially going to be planning for their roadways, and the city is going to be focusing on its corridors and the state roads that run through the city of Port St. Lucie. And so everything that's shown is in red is where there's a proposal to add road capacity. Everything shown in green is where there's going to be a multimodal only improvement. So this map has actually been updated from the one that was in the phase 1 mobility plan. In addition, in phase 1 and phase 2, we identified a number of potential intersection improvements. Again, this map actually reflects where we're at today, not where we were at in the phase 2. So a lot more facilities have actually been added to the map itself. So this is actually a further breakdown of what types of improvements are going to be made. So in terms of adding capacity, there are new roads that will include multimodal elements. And you'll see all the new roads, I'm just double checking, but I'm pretty sure every single new road is west of Interstate 95. And that's all sort of the brown burgundy type color line that you see. Those are all new roadways, and primarily those roadways are being built by future developments as part of their obligations to develop. So they'll be building that network in the future, and then they'll be building a supporting local network as part of their developments. But those roadways are largely an obligation and a responsibility of new development. They'll be designed with complete street elements. But those are really primarily new road corridors. There are a few. We're going to evaluate these a little bit further, but portions of Village Parkway, portions of Community Parkway, there are future plans to add additional lanes to those. I think we're going to call those as a future phase much further out. So I think there's going to be actually adequate road capacity with both what's built today and what's being planned in the future. Village Parkway may ultimately need to be 6-lane, but if the multimodal improvements are made, it's a possibility that that corridor could stay as a 4-lane roadway. And so going to the east, you see a lot more multimodal projects start to pick up. And we started off having a number of roadways that were going to be widened from 2 to 4 lanes or 4 to 6 lanes. And so what we've ended up with is, after further analyses, and we'll go through the cross sections that we're looking at, the roadways that we're actually proposing to add capacity to are St. Lucie West between the interstate and roughly Kashmere Boulevard going from 4 to 6 lanes. California going from Del Rio south of the Crosstown Parkway up to St. Lucie West going to 4 lanes. St. Lucie Boulevard or Port St. Lucie Boulevard from south of Gatlin all the way down to Becker going to 4 lanes. And then South Bend Boulevard from Floresta down to Becker as well, going to 4 lanes. And then we are also looking at possibility of a portion of Oak Ridge and Bayshore also going to 4 lanes, but we'll share a little bit more detail on that. All the corridors that you see in purple, those are all where we're proposing to add a center turn lane. So it go from a 2-lane undivided roadway to a 2-lane divided road. And the best example of that is what the city is building today on Floresta Drive. So think of what's happening on Floresta and seeing that replicated on California, Savona, Kashmere, Village Green Parkway, Selvets, Torino. A lot of the roadways, if they have a center turn lane and take some of those turning vehicles out, plus multimodal improvements, can actually accommodate a lot of future traffic. And then we're also looking at a few major Greenway corridors going largely along either power line easements in the northern part of the city, the C-24 canal in the central part, or along a power line strip easement parallel to 95. Similarly, we've also looked at multimodal intersections in terms of whether they need a roundabout, turn lanes, or multimodal improvements. So again, you'll see several additional projects that have been added between this phase and the phase 2. The orange and the yellow, the orange are largely multimodal improvements, and those are to improve crossing those roadways. The yellow are also mid-block crossings or along trails. That's the C-24 Canal Trail, where it crosses major roadways. This is the Greenway to the north. And each one of those that you see there actually crosses a roadway. In addition, there are a few other multimodal improvements planned within the city. So with that said, that provides all the bigger foundation. Then we've actually gone pretty much corridor by corridor and have further evaluated them. So the first one we looked at is St. Lucie West from 95 to Kashmere. The roadway carries about 37,000 cars a day today. Its capacity is about 40,000. By 2045, we project that there's going to be almost 60,000 cars a day using St. Lucie West. That's way more than what a 2-lane or 4-lane road can handle. So one of the things that we evaluated for St. Lucie West was adding an additional through lane to make that a 6-lane roadway. In addition, proposing to add multimodal ways on both sides of that cross section to accommodate golf carts, to accommodate neighborhood electric vehicles. We've gone back and forth on whether or not autonomous transit shuttles will be appropriate there. And the one concern, will they work great out in Traditions where you have controlled access? This portion of St. Lucie Boulevard, you have driveways every 200 feet. So there's a lot of crossings for an autonomous shuttle to address. So it's something we're going to have to further evaluate. But we do feel that there are several golf course communities to both the north and south of St. Lucie West. So we think there's actually a real propensity for people to use golf carts in this area as a mode of travel. As we had mentioned earlier, we also looked at a dedicated transit lane as opposed to 6-laning the roadway. And there was a lot of discussion on that initially, but as a community, the density is just not there yet. It may be in the future, but as of right now, it's just not there to warrant a dedicated bus lane. So our recommendation will actually be the 6-lane with multimodal improvements. South Bend the corridor today. It's carrying roughly 16,000 cars a day from Oak Ridge all the way down to Snow. In the future, we're expecting it to carry upwards to 26,000 cars a day. In a 2-lane road, be congested, can handle about 20, 25 max. Once you kind of get beyond the 20,000, you have to really look at adding some additional lanes. So what we're proposing on South Bend is a 2-phased approach. 1, keeping the roadway where it is today. 2, adding shared use pathways for people powered with, highly amenitized landscaping, adding an additional 8-foot multimodal way for golf carts and neighborhood electric vehicles. Potentially, they could even accommodate an autonomous transit shuttle. And here you don't have as many driveways, so it may actually work. But that would be phase 1 of South Bend. And phase 2 would eventually be 4-laning that facility. I mean, as you see there, the travel lanes are marked as 10-foot to 11-foot lanes, and you see a shoulder on both sides. Again, that's sort of to try to slow those speeds down a little bit on these roadways, but then still recognize to the provision of a shoulder that you have buses, you have people pulling boats, you have larger vehicles that are going to move. But for the most part, for cars, they would visibly be seeing a narrower travel lane. Further on from South Bend, from Snow down to Becker, where you sort of get out of the residential subdivision, to the north there in this community. Once you get south of that, there actually are no developments that have access to it. This golf course community has a berm along this whole way, so there actually aren't a whole lot of driveways there. That's projected to carry upwards to 24,000 by 2045. Could it function as a 2-lane? Yes. Would it be extremely congested? Yes. So we're actually proposing 2 4-lane South Bend Boulevard. Initially, we'd look to add the multimodal facilities. There's already a shared use pathway out there, so we'd actually look, especially the distance. I think it's almost 2.5 miles from that subdivision all the way down to, or that neighborhood down to Becker. And so at that distance, you're really talking more golf cart, neighborhood electric vehicle, electric devices, or somebody walking or jogging for exercise purposes, but that's quite a bit of a distance for sort of day-to-day transportation. So this is how a 4-lane facility would fit in with multimodal facilities along both sides. We've also recently looked at one of the big questions that we've been asked consistently for over a year now. If you're 4-laning South Bend, what happens when you get north of the C-24 canal? Right now, that roadway would either go to the east and use Floresta, or go to the west and use Oak Ridge and Bayshore. So we've kind of been struggling with this. How do you make this additional connection between the C-24 canal and Port St. Lucie? And we've really been looking detailed at the right-of-way, and it's something we're going to have to talk further with the Public Works Department on and evaluate further. But there's actually either a large, either private previous roadway, boulevard cross-section, stormwater facility, canal, what have you. But south of Oak Ridge, there's a roughly 120-foot right-of-way that goes along the entire length of it. Then you have the roadway itself, and then from this connection over to the turnpike, Bayshore Boulevard is actually a 100-foot right-of-way. And most of the driveways on the east side of the road all come off the side street, whereas along Floresta and Oak Ridge, all the driveways are directly to these roadways. So there's a lot of connections there. But we feel that there's a possibility to either look to add 2 lanes south of Oak Ridge, possibly look at a 1-way pair on Oak Ridge in this roadway, or even just additional lanes on this corridor itself and leave Oak Ridge alone completely. And then there's a large 50-foot wide canal / drainage easement / green area along Bay Shore that could actually serve as a really nice linear park. And this would tie into a larger multimodal system using the C-24 canal all the way out past Traditions. So that's something that we've just recently come across because we've been consistently asked through both the outreach we've already had and through the phase 1 mobility plan. You know, that's great you're doing South Bend, but how do we make the connection between the canal and Port St. Lucie? So this is one of the alternatives we're looking at. Other corridor we looked at is East Torino to the north, coming south of Midway, going all the way down to, depending on what nomenclature you use, the connection to Kashmir or Peacock down there. That roadway today carries about 15,000 cars a day. In the future, it's projected to carry about 23,000. You know, it's over the 20,000 limit, but it's under the 25. So we're actually looking at multimodal facilities along that roadway. So to widen it to a 2-lane divided, so you take out some of the turning movements from that corridor. Adding a shared use pathway on both sides of the road, and then adding a multimodal ways to both sides of the road as well. You'll see on these corridors, these sections are actually smaller. We don't really believe the densities, intensities up here, or the mixture of uses would really justify an autonomous transit shuttle or a wider transit circulator. But there still could either be people using golf carts, or there could be some type of transit service provided through neighborhood electric vehicles. But both of those could be accommodated on a 6-foot wide multimodal way as opposed to a larger facility. So this is the one thing that we're going to recommend for East Torino Parkway. The other corridor that we did look at is 4-laning that roadway. Some of the feedback and discussion that we've had to date, if you have a 2-lane road today and you add multimodal to it, and then that doesn't solve traffic, and then you got to go to 4-lane, would you still keep those multimodal improvements? And that's actually a really good question, because in some respects, the multimodal didn't work as well as you'd hoped it would, and now you need the 4-lane the road. So we think initially it actually can work, and it can work quite well. But if not, we have looked at the option of 4-laning Torino Parkway. We've also looked at Bay Shore between Selvitz and Prima Vista. And similar to the Bay Shore south of Port St. Lucie, that's a 2-lane roadway today. This is also a 2-lane road, but unlike that section, all the homes along it take direct access to Bay Shore, similar to what's along Floresta. So it becomes a little bit harder of a facility to think about 4-laning. It's 17,000 cars a day, projected to go upwards to 21,000. Again, it's a lot of traffic, but it's not quite the trigger to really say you should 4-lane it. So we are looking at the potential to go to a 2-lane divided section, or at least a 2-foot with raised medians in certain portions of the roadway, and then adding either a shared use pathway on one side or both, or a separate facility for bikes and separate facility for using the existing sidewalk. So there's several multimodal options that are available for this corridor. We did look at 4-laning it, but given the sheer number of driveways and the fact that the volumes weren't exceeding 25,000, our recommendation is going to be a 2-lane divided. We've looked at California from St. Lucie to the crosstown. This roadway carries almost 20,000 cars a day as it is, and it's projected to go up to 32,000. There are already actually plans to 4-lane this roadway. So we really didn't look at a phase 1 option because the volumes warrant a 4-lane road. So we looked at how the multimodal facilities could be configured, and then how that fits within a 4-lane cross section. I believe the city's public works department is actually engaged with an engineer right now who we've had conversations with that is designing a facility that looks similar to this. 4 travel lanes, 2 separate lanes for electric vehicles, i.e. bikes, scooters, golf carts, and then 2 other lanes for people walking and bicycling. We looked at California further south, and initially between the Crosstown and Del Rio, we consider the 2-lane divided. But given the traffic and area and the fact that it's going to approach 25,000, at least on that section of roadway, we are recommending 4-laning it with the multimodal facilities on both sides. But then when you get south of Del Rio, going down to Savona, the future volumes drop from basically that 25 threshold down to 20,000. And there we're actually looking at a 2-lane divided facility. Think of the median similar to what you see on Floresta today, but then either having shared use pathways on both sides of the roadway or a sidewalk and a multimodal way on both sides. The right-of-way is wide enough to accommodate multiple sections. Really, I think drainage as they go to the next phase of design will be the bigger determinant of what type of multimodal facility that you'd have on there. Similar to California, Savona we looked at, and honestly, Savona was really close. It's above 22.5. It's not to 25 exactly, but it's close. So we are still recommending a 2-lane divided, because we're going to share with you another improvement that we found that we feel will actually keep Savona from needing to be 4-laned. So again, we believe that similar to California, Savona could be a 2-lane divided section. And that other improvement, there's actually a right-of-way that's already in place today, dedicated, that the city owns. There's already a stub for Savage Boulevard going to the C-24 canal, and that right-of-way goes over to Del Rio Boulevard. So at some point, there was always a plan to make that connection. And we feel that by utilizing Savage Boulevard and making that connection over to Del Rio, you can actually keep from having the 4-lane Savona. So, we're further evaluating that. That was not something that was identified in the phase 1 plan, but it is something that we have identified in the phase 2 plan. And we believe it's a viable alternative to 4-laning Savona. And this sort of just shows you how that could work. I mean, this basically would give you 2 parallel corridors. So you'd have Savage, which exists today up until there. You make the connection to Del Rio. So all these people now that either go to Savona or go down to Gatlin will have another way to go out into Del Rio. And then once you reach Del Rio, the first major corridor would be California, hence the need to 4-lane that section. But also potentially, there are going to be other people using this, and the traffic that we've seen on Kashmir. This is another one that we had not initially identified, but we are recommending that it goes to 2-lane divided with additional intersection improvements at the Crosstown Parkway. But this would provide through Del Rio and Kashmir, through Cameo, through Savona to California, and through Savage, essentially 4 now north-south corridors as opposed to 3. And then providing access to all these residents here would certainly provide both relief to this portion of Savona as well as relief to this portion of California. Similarly, Kashmir is a corridor that we looked at. The volumes don't warrant 4-lane, but they certainly do warrant a 2-lane divided. So that's what we're recommending, 2-lane divided with additional turn lanes at the intersection of the Crosstown. Kashmir, which connects Torino and Peacock, the roadway was looked originally at 4-laning potentially, but the future volumes just really aren't there to warrant that. So we are looking at a 2-lane divided, and then the city itself has just recently completed or is completing the roundabout at Torino and Kashmir, which we feel will help facilitate a lot of vehicular movement. We've also looked at Kashmir by the school. And this is a corridor that actually has a lot of traffic, largely because of the school itself. And it actually has enough volume to warrant it being 4-laned. But what we're going to look at is having some type of access lane, either separated or part of the roadway, going north into the school, plus some multimodal facilities to make it safer for kids to walk and bike along that corridor, or even to ride a golf cart or have a parent bring them on a golf cart from some of the surrounding neighborhoods to the school, to hopefully lessen how many people are driving on there, but also to add a longer northbound lane, recognizing that people are going to get off or they pull to the side today to wait for their kids. We're actually looking at a section that takes that lane and actually separates it from traffic. So that's something that we're evaluating further. But if warranted, we don't feel it will be, but if warranted, there's enough room to 4-lane Kashmir as well in the future. We also looked at Selvets from Midway down the Bay Shore. The roadway today is not carrying that much in the way of traffic, just under 10,000 cars a day. It's projected to be about 15 in the future. So we're recommending a 2-lane divided section with multimodal facilities for that roadway. Becker has been an interesting one. It's got quite a bit of traffic today, 15,000. It's got a lot of proposed development that's been approved. The developers of that community did a detailed traffic study, and the results of their analysis showed that 4 lanes wasn't warranted. Time will ultimately be the best tell of that. It does essentially trigger the threshold, but the developments that are out there today are actually adding roundabouts at the major intersections and have already constructed some multimodal facilities. So there's 3 out there that are under construction or done. There's another one that's going to be constructed. So we're going to see how the roundabouts play out. Continue to leave Becker as a 2-lane roadway, and then add to the multimodal facilities that they've already put out there today. And then sort of just keep an annual monitoring of it into the future to see about a 4-laning if warranted. Another corridor we looked at, and this is more for multimodal, not for roadway widening because the volumes are pretty low, but there are missing gaps on Par Drive today of the sidewalk network. So we looked at what types of improvements could be done there. And we feel that there's actually enough right-of-way to add multi or shared use pathways on both sides of the road and to continue to keep it as a 4-lane roadway. We also looked at Rosser because there's this big sidewalk gap on that corridor today, and it's only on one side of the street. Unfortunately, because of the limited right-of-way and the drainage situation there, the only thing that will be able to be done on Rosser is to make the sidewalk continuous all the way down the Par on one side of the roadway. An intersection that we have been asked to look at, there's been a lot of neighborhood complaints about the intersection of Dreyfus Boulevard and Rosser Boulevard, and about the difficulty getting out of that intersection. There's not a whole lot we can do. The right-of-way is extremely restricted, and there are homes on all sides of the intersection today, in addition to a driveway that pretty much lines up with Dreyfus. So there's actually a large portion of land owned by the city of Port St. Lucie north of the neighborhood. So we think there's actually an opportunity to extend Cascade Road and then provide a roundabout at the intersection with Boykin. And that would actually provide this entire neighborhood with another way to get into and out. And the roundabout allows for a lot more even flow of traffic. We've also looked at the potential for a multimodal overpass on Par Road going into the Traditions community. Something that's probably well into the future, but one that may be a little bit more midterm, and it's been evaluated, is a new interchange between Gatlin and Becker at roughly Marshall Parkway. Now, this will be a roadway interchange going to Tradition, serving a lot of this future industrial development going on out there. And then to the east, it would actually be a multimodal connection that goes around this existing stormwater pond that the city is proposing to have a park along a portion of there, and also to the north. And then we feel that since we're limited on Rosser, there is actually a large power line corridor from Parr going all the way up to St. Lucie West. So we're actually evaluating a greenway or a multi-use trail along that corridor. In addition, there are a few other smaller roadways that we've looked at in terms of connections. This is one corridor that will be evaluated, Tunis Ave, extending over into the neighborhood. There are going to be several changes to roadways as part of the 4-laning of Port St. Lucie Boulevard. And this is going to have some impact on existing road connections in that area. So we've looked at this as one possible connection into that community to address some of the other roadways that may actually be closed off or have turning movements restricted because of the design of Port St. Lucie. So Tunis is one. There's a lot of multimodal destinations, parks, schools, retails in this area. There's a possibility that it could warrant a signal in the future if there was actually a connection to that roadway. Similarly, we're looking at an extension of Gig Place to Galbraith Avenue, because there are several roads further south of Port St. Lucie that are going to have access restricted. So there may need to be another way to have a neighborhood connection out to that roadway. Again, similar to Tunis, there's several other factors being looked at. The one corridor that we have not been able to propose any multimodal improvements to is pretty much the heart of the community, or a good portion of the heart of the community. And that's Port St. Lucie Boulevard from US 1 to Gatlin. It is a 6-lane divided roadway today. There are no bike lanes. The travel lanes are only 11 foot. Sidewalks are 5 foot. And there are, retaining walls along portions of both of the sides of the roadway. So there's essentially nothing multimodal that can be done to Port St. Lucie Boulevard other than taking the outside travel lane and repurposing it to a protected bike lane and a dedicated neighborhood electric vehicle, autonomous shuttle, golf cart lane. That is one option. That could be done in a year, and it could be done for really cheap. But that portion of the St. Lucie Boulevard carries over 50,000 cars a day. So that'd be a pretty big trade-off to recommend removing one of those lanes. So to do that, we're actually looking at how do we make multimodal connections at all along that corridor, because a 5-foot sidewalk is not going to get anybody to go actively walk along that roadway unless they have no other choice. So we're looking at parallel facilities. One, a multimodal bridge connecting the boardwalk that the city's already built on the east side of the St. Lucie River over to the west side, and running a shared use path coming down to Essex, going all the way parallel to Gatlin, and eventually tying into a multimodal trail or a shared use path on Oak Ridge or a future improvement here. Potential for either a pedestrian only signal right there at the end of the bridge, or an underpass under the bridge itself that would then connect up to multimodal improvements going to the north. So as we go further and further as part of this phase 2 mobility plan, we're getting down to this level of detail now. And ultimately, this level of detail is going to be portrayed in all the maps and the tables, along with several cross sections. So I know that we've covered a lot in a little over an hour. It's something that's going to continue to be ongoing over these next few months. And as we go forward, more and more detail is going to be provided on the city's website. So we'll start providing refined cross sections. As we get further along with the maps, we'll finalize those maps, and then ultimately we'll finalize the tables. And then all this is actually going to feed into not only a final adopted mobility plan, but eventually an update to the city's mobility fee as well. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen for a little bit, and we're going to open it up to Q&A. I may need to go back to sharing my screen to refer to a specific graphic or map or question that somebody has. So with that, I think I may open it back up to Laura or Lauren to kind of address any questions that may have been asked.
All right, so thank you so very much, Jonathan. Excellent presentation as always, very informative. I'll open it up to see if there's any questions. I know we haven't seen anything yet through the presentation. Unsurprisingly, we are getting very close to the holiday. I know everybody's pretty anxious to start that.
And Jonathan's presentation had a lot of good information as well. So hopefully everyone's feeling like they have a pretty good grasp on what's being proposed and what the larger concepts and approaches that will be implemented in the mobility plan. I think if anyone would like an opportunity to speak, I think it's also a possibility to use the raise your hand function at the bottom of the screen. And our tech person can unmute you if you would like to speak. Maybe we'll just wait another minute or so for people to put in questions at the last minute here.
And we did share a lot of information, and it's a lot to go over. This will all be making itself to the city's website. There will likely be a very formal presentation or a workshop before the city council sometime in the August, September timeframe. We'll provide further detail on that as those dates get solidified. So we'll continue to allow or encourage any feedback that you have, but we will continue to sort of fine tune this plan. And it will ultimately, the product you'll have is some really attractive maps, cross sections, some aerial renderings, some future scenarios, and then a very detailed list of the projects themselves. And then as well, for anybody interested, there'll be ultimately an update of the mobility fee as well that comes along this. But our focus right now is really making sure we get a multimodal system that the city staff's comfortable with, for us then to go to the city council and kind of get their final approval on. And then once we have that, we'll go forward with the mobility fee update.
And I've just placed the link to the city's website in the chat box for everyone. So that is where we will be posting all of the materials from our public meetings. And Laura, is there a place on the website where people can submit feedback at a later time if they want, or should they email? How would people get in touch with us?
That's an excellent question. And they can, there is a contact on the city's website where you can contact the impact mobility fee specialist and myself directly to provide those questions. We'll make sure that those get answered for you at any point in time. Feel free to reach out to city staff. We're more than happy to address those. So that being said, I think that we're going to get a lot of replay viewers. Again, I would like to thank everybody for their time in attending, and especially New Urban for that very excellent presentation. So again, everybody in the audience, thank you. We greatly appreciate your time. It was a lot to absorb, and any replay viewers, feel free to reach out to us. So that being said, I think we'll conclude it for the evening. I hope everybody has a safe and happy holiday.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Have a good night.